Chekhov's gun is an oft-cited principle in the writing community, and its most famous iteration goes something like this. If a gun is hanging on the wall in the first act, it must go off by the third act. As Lincoln Michel of Countercraft has noted, people tend to interpret Chekhov's gun in three different ways. One, everything in the story must cohere, no detail should be irrelevant. Two, big events in the story need to be foreshadowed or at least planted earlier. And three, don't make promises to the reader that you don't follow up on. Really, all three of these interpretations are pretty good writing advice, but most experts I know tend to think of Chekhov's gun in the third interpretation, though it is related to the first. Now, let's look at that first interpretation. Everything in the story must cohere. No detail should be irrelevant. Some people object to this idea. Can't we describe a room as having blue drapes or a character as having brown hair without the blueness of the drapes or the brownness of the hair, creating a later explosion within the story? Certainly, not all details are going to be equally consequential. Blue drapes are less capable of explosive violence than a gun is, and Chekhov did not say that if there are blue drapes hanging in the first act, they need to be used to smother someone in the third act. He did say, however, remove everything that has no relevance to the story. But what kind of relevance was he talking about there? Consequence for plot is one kind of relevance. Mood, ambiance, characterization, these are others. I tend to think Chekhov was actually talking about plot, though I admit that may be an imperfect term here. In his book, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, George Saunders says he doesn't like the word plot. He prefers to call it meaningful action. As the story proceeds, the reader starts to develop some expectations for meaningful action. That is, because we know that a story is about meaningful action, we guess that the events will have consequence. As Saunders says, if a story begins once there was a boy who was afraid of water, we expect that a pond, river, ocean, waterfall, bathtub, or tsunami will soon appear. Now, when we think about plot, we often associate it with structure, and I really love the way Saunders goes on to define story structure as an organizational scheme that allows the story to answer a question it has caused its readers to ask. I'd argue that Chekhov was thinking more or less in the same way as Saunders. His gun is about plot and structure, not about mood, ambiance, characterization, symbolism, or theme per se. He was thinking about meaningful action and organizing a story around reader expectations and questions. So Chekhov's gun is really about making a tacit promise to the reader that something will be significant. If you make that promise, you need to follow up on it. Some people kind of reverse Chekhov's gun and say not that if there's a gun in the first act, it needs to go off by the third, but rather if a gun goes off in the third act, it needs to have been planted in the first. And I mean, that's not necessarily bad advice. You do want to earn story developments and revelations by setting them up in some way. But Chekhov didn't state that assertion in that direction. So I think the principle is more about promises than about earning story events. Now, this said, I would argue that you can toy with or subvert those promises to a certain extent. The gun maybe doesn't need to go off in the third act. Perhaps instead someone attempts to use it, but it's not loaded. Or they use it as a pry bar or something unexpected. If you do this, then, as Kelly Link says, what you do instead has to be more interesting or exciting than what the reader thought they were going to get. And when faced with the proposition that there should be a term for Chekhov's gun that is used in an unexpected way, Link suggested Chekhov's fun, which is like a literary dad joke, and I love it. So there you go, my attempt at explaining Chekhov's gun. Some links for you and further reading below. Thanks for watching.